Chapter 23. "I've done it," George cried. "What do you mean, I've done it? And what have I done?" Amberson had collapsed into an easy chair beside his dressing table, the white evening tie he had been about to put on dangling from his hand, which had fallen limply on the arm of the chair. The tie dropped to the floor before he replied, and the hand that had held it was lifted to stroke his graying hair reflectively. "By Jove," he muttered, "this is too bad." George folded his arms bitterly. "Will you kindly answer my question? What have I done that wasn't honorable and right? Do you think these riffraff can go about bandying my mother's name?" "They can now," said Amberson. "I don't know if they could before, but they certainly can now." "What do you mean by that?" His uncle sighed profoundly, picked up his tie, and, preoccupied with despondency, twisted the strip of white lawn till it became unwearable. Meanwhile he tried to enlighten his nephew. "Gossip is never fatal, Georgie," he said, "until it is denied. Gossip goes on about every human being alive, and about all the dead that are alive enough to be remembered, and yet almost never does any harm until some defender makes a controversy. Gossip's a nasty thing, but it's sickly, and if people of good intentions will let it entirely alone, it will die 99 times out of 100. "See here," George said, "I didn't come to listen to any generalizing dose of philosophy. I ask you—" "You asked me what you've done, and I'm telling you." Amberson gave him a melancholy smile, continuing, "Suffer me to do it in my own way. Fanny says there's been talk about your mother, and that Mrs. Johnson does some of it. I don't know, because naturally nobody would come to me with such stuff, or mention it before me, but it's presumably true. I suppose it is. I've seen Fanny with Mrs. Johnson quite a lot, and that old lady is a notorious gossip, and that's why she ordered you out of her house when you pinned her down that she'd been gossiping. I have a suspicion Mrs. Johnson has been quite a comfort to Fanny in their long talks, but she'll probably quit speaking to her over this, because Fanny told you. I suppose it's true that the whole town, a lot of others, that is, do share in the gossip. In this town, naturally, anything about any Amberson has always been a stone dropped into the center of a pond, and a lie would send the ripples as far as a truth would. I've been on a steamer when the story went all over the boat the second day out that the prettiest girl on board didn't have any ears, and you can take it as a rule that when a woman's past 35, the prettier her hair is, the more certain you are to meet somebody with reliable information that it's a wig. You can be sure that for many years there's been more gossip in this place about the Ambersons than about any other family. I dare say it isn't so much so now as it used to be, because the town got too big long ago, but it's the truth that the more prominent you are, the more gossip there is about you, and the more people would like to pull you down. Well, they can't do it as long as you refuse to know what gossip there is about you, but the minute you notice it, it's got you. I'm not speaking of certain kinds of slander that sometimes people have got to take to the courts. I'm talking of the wretched buzzing the Mrs. Johnsons do, the thing you seem to have such a horror of, people talking, the kind of thing that has assailed your mother. People who have repeated a slander either get ashamed or forget it if they're let alone. Challenge them, and in self-defense they'll believe everything they've said. They'd rather believe you a sinner than believe themselves liars, naturally. Submit to gossip and you kill it. Fight it and you make it strong. People will forget almost any slander except one that's been fought." "Is that all?" George asked. "I suppose so," his uncle murmured sadly. "Well, then, may I ask what you'd have done in my place?" "I'm not sure, Georgie. When I was your age, I was like you in many ways, especially in not being very cool-headed, so I can't say. Youth can't be trusted for much, except asserting itself and fighting and making love." "Indeed," George snorted. "May I ask what you think I ought to have done?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" George echoed, mocking bitterly. "I suppose you think I mean to let my mother's good name—" "Your mother's good name," Amberson cut him off impatiently. "Nobody has a good name in a bad mouth. Nobody has a good name in a silly mouth, either. Well, your mother's name was in some silly mouths, and all you've done was to go and have a scene with the worst old woman gossip in the town. A scene that's going to make her into a partisan against your mother, whereas she was a mere prattler before. Don't you suppose she'll be all over town with this tomorrow? Tomorrow? Why, she'll have her telephone going tonight as long as any of her friends are up. People that never heard anything about this are going to hear it all now with embellishments, and she'll see to it that everybody who's hinted anything about poor Isabel will know that you're on the warpath, and that will put them on the defensive and make them vicious. The story will grow as it spreads, and George unfolded his arms to strike his right fist into his left palm. "But do you suppose I'm going to tolerate such things?" he shouted. "What do you suppose I'll be doing?" "Nothing helpful." "Oh, you think so, do you?" "You can do absolutely nothing," said Amberson. "Nothing of any use. The more you do, the more harm you'll do. You'll see. I'm going to stop this thing if I have to force my way into every house on National Avenue and Amberson Boulevard." His uncle laughed rather sourly, but made no other comment. "Well, what do you propose to do?" George demanded. "Do you propose to sit there, yes, and let this riffraff bandy my mother's good name back and forth among them? Is that what you propose to do?" "It's all I can do," Amberson returned. "It's all any of us can do now. Just sit still and hope that the thing may die down in time, in spite of your stirring up that awful old woman." George drew a long breath and then advanced and stood close before his uncle. "Didn't you understand me when I told you that people are saying my mother means to marry this man?" "Yes, I understood you." "You say that my going over there has made matters worse," George went on. "How about it if such an unspeakable marriage did take place? Do you think that would make people believe they'd been wrong in saying you know what they say?" "No," said Amberson deliberately, "I don't believe it would. There'd be more badness in the bad mouths, and more silliness in the silly mouths, I dare say. But it wouldn't hurt Isabel and Eugene if they never heard of it, and if they did hear of it, then they could take their choice between placating gossip or living for their own happiness. If they have decided to marry—" George almost staggered. "Good God!" he gasped. "You speak of it calmly." Amberson looked up at him inquiringly. "Why shouldn't they marry if they want to?" he asked. "It's their own affair." "Why shouldn't they?" George echoed. "Why shouldn't they?" "Yes, why shouldn't they? I don't see anything precisely monstrous about two people getting married when they're both free and care about each other. What's the matter with their marrying?" "It would be monstrous!" George shouted. "Monstrous! Even if this horrible thing hadn't happened. But now in the face of this, oh, that you can sit there and even speak of it! Your own sister! Oh, God! Oh!" He became incoherent, swinging away from Amberson and making for the door, wildly gesturing. "For heaven's sake, don't be so theatrical," said his uncle, and then, seeing that George was leaving the room, "Come back here. You mustn't speak to your mother of this." "Don't intend to," George said indistinctly, and he plunged out into the big dimly lit hall. He passed his grandfather's room on the way to the stairs, and the Major was visible within, his white head brightly illuminated by a lamp, as he bent low over a ledger upon his roll-top desk. He did not look up, and his grandson strode by the door, not really conscious of the old figure stooping at its tremulous work, with long additions and subtractions that refused to balance as they used to. George went home and got a hat and overcoat without seeing either his mother or Fanny. Then he left word that he would be out for dinner, and hurried away from the house. He walked the dark streets of Amberson Addition for an hour, then went downtown and got coffee at a restaurant. After that he walked through the lighted parts of the town until 10 o'clock, when he turned north and came back to the purlieu of the Addition. He strode through the length and breadth of it again, his hat pulled down over his forehead, his overcoat collar turned up behind. He walked fiercely, though his feet ached, and by he turned homeward, and, when he reached the Major's, went in and sat upon the steps of the huge stone veranda in front, an obscure figure in that lonely and repellent place. All lights were out at the Major's, and finally, after 12, he saw his mother's window darken at home. He waited half an hour longer, then crossed the front yards of the new houses and let himself noiselessly in the front door. The light in the hall had been left burning, and another in his own room, as he discovered when he got there. He locked the door quickly and without noise, but his fingers were still upon the key when there was a quick footfall in the hall outside. "Georgie, dear?" He went to the other end of the room before replying. "Yes." "I've been wondering where you were, dear." "Had you?" There was a pause. Then she said timidly, "Whatever it was, I hope you had a pleasant evening." After a silence, "Thank you," he said, without expression. Another silence followed before she spoke again. "You wouldn't care to be kissed good night, I suppose?" And with a little flurry of placative laughter, she added, "At your age, of course." "I'm going to bed now," he said. "Good night." Another silence seemed blanker than those which had preceded it, and finally her voice came. It was blank, too. "Good night." After he was in bed, his thoughts became more tumultuous than ever, while among all the inchoate and fragmentary sketches of this dreadful day now rising before him, the clearest was of his uncle collapsed in a big chair with a white tie dangling from his hand, and one conviction following upon that picture became definite in George's mind, that his uncle George Amberson was a hopeless dreamer from whom no help need be expected, an amiable imbecile lacking in normal impulses, and wholly useless in a struggle which required honor to be defended by a man of action. Then would return a vision of Mrs. Johnson's furious round head, set behind her great bosom like the sun far sunk on the horizon of a mountain plateau, and her crackling asthmatic voice. "Without sharing in other people's disposition to put an evil interpretation on what may be nothing more than unfortunate appearances, other people may be less considerate in not confining their discussion of it, as I have, to charitable views. You'll know something pretty quick. You'll know you're out on the street." And then George would get up again and pace the floor in his bare feet. That was what the tormented young man was doing when daylight came gauntly in at his window, pacing the floor, rubbing his head in his hands, and muttering, "It can't be true. This can't be happening to me." Chapter 24. Breakfast was brought to him in his room, as usual, but he did not make his normal healthy raid upon the dainty tray. The food remained untouched, and he sustained himself upon coffee, 4 cups of it, which left nothing of value inside the glistening little percolator. During this process he heard his mother being summoned to the telephone in the hall, not far from his door, and then her voice responding. "Yes? Oh, it's you. Indeed I should. Of course. Then I'll expect you about 3. Yes. Goodbye till then." A few minutes later he heard her speaking to someone beneath his window, and, looking out, saw her directing the removal of plants from a small garden bed to the Major's conservatory for the winter. There was an air of briskness about her. As she turned away to go into the house she laughed gaily with the Major's gardener over something he said, and this unconcerned cheerfulness of her was terrible to her son. He went to his desk and, searching the jumbled contents of a drawer, brought forth a large unframed photograph of his father, upon which he gazed long and piteously, till at last hot tears stood in his eyes. It was strange how the inconsequent face of Wilbur seemed to increase in high significance during this belated interview between father and son, and how it seemed to take on a reproachful nobility, and yet, under the circumstances, nothing could have been more natural than that George, having paid but the slightest attention to his father in life, should begin to deify him now that he was dead. "Poor, poor father," the son whispered brokenly. "Poor man, I'm glad you didn't know." He wrapped the picture in a sheet of newspaper, put it under his arm, and, leaving the house hurriedly and stealthily, went downtown to the shop of a silversmith, where he spent $60 on a resplendently festooned silver frame for the picture. Having lunched upon more coffee, he returned to the house at 2 o'clock, carrying the framed photograph with him, and placed it upon the center table in the library, the room most used by Isabel and Fanny and himself. Then he went to a front window of the long reception room and sat looking out through the lace curtains. The house was quiet, though once or twice he heard his mother and Fanny moving about upstairs, and a ripple of song in the voice of Isabel, a fragment from the romantic ballad of Lord Bateman. Lord Bateman was a noble lord of high degree, and he sailed west and he sailed east, far countries for to see. The words became indistinct, the air was hummed absently, the humming shifted to a whistle, then drifted out of hearing, and the place was still again. George looked often at his watch, but his vigil did not last an hour. At 3:10, peering through the curtain, he saw an automobile stop in front of the house, and Eugene Morgan jump lightly down from it. The car was of a new pattern, low and long, with an ample seat in the tonneau facing forward, and a professional driver sat at the wheel, a strange figure in leather, goggled out of all personality and seemingly part of the mechanism. Eugene himself, as he came up the cement path to the house, was a figure of the new era which was in time to be so disastrous to skiff hats and skirted coats, and his appearance afforded a debonair contrast to that of the queer-looking duck capering at the Amberson ball in an old dress coat, and chugging up National Avenue through the snow in his nightmare of a sewing machine. Eugene, this afternoon, was richly in the new outdoor mode. Motoring coat was soft gray fur, his cap and gloves were of gray suede, and though Lucy's hand may have shown itself in the selection of these gamitures, he wore them easily, even with becoming hint of jauntiness. Some change might be seen in his face, too, for a successful man is seldom to be mistaken, especially if his temper is genial. Eugene had begun to look like a millionaire. But above everything else, what was most evident about him as he came up the path was confidence in the happiness promised by his errand. The anticipation in his eyes could have been read by a stranger. His look at the door of Isabel's house was the look of a man who is quite certain that the next moment will reveal something ineffably charming, inexpressibly dear. When the bell rang, George waited at the entrance of the reception room until a housemaid came through the hall on her way to answer the summons. "You needn't mind, Mary," he told her. "I'll see who it is and what they want. Probably it's only a peddler." "Thank you, sir, Mr. George," said Mary, and returned to the rear of the house. George went slowly to the front door and halted, regarding the misty silhouette of the collar upon the ornamental frosted glass. After a minute of waiting, this silhouette changed outline so that an arm could be distinguished, an arm outstretched toward the bell, as if the gentleman outside doubted whether or not it had sounded, and were minded to try again. But before the gesture was completed, George abruptly threw open the door, and stepped squarely upon the middle of the threshold. A slight change shadowed the face of Eugene. His look of happy anticipation gave way to something formal and polite. "How do you do, George?" he said. "Mrs. Minifer expects to go driving with me, I believe, if you'll be so kind as to send her word that I'm here." George made not the slightest movement. "No," he said. Eugene was incredulous, even when his second glance revealed how hot of eye was the haggard young man before him. "I beg your pardon. I heard you," said George. "You said you had an engagement with my mother, and I told you no." Eugene gave him a steady look, and then he asked quietly, "What is the difficulty?" George kept his own voice quiet enough, but that did not mitigate the vibrant fury of it. "My mother will have no interest in knowing that you came for her today," he said, "or any other day." Eugene continued to look at him with a scrutiny in which began to gleam a profound anger, none the less powerful because it was so quiet. "I am afraid I do not understand you." "I doubt if I could make it much plainer," George said, raising his voice slightly, "but I'll try. You're not wanted in this house, Mr. Morgan, now or at any other time. Perhaps you'll understand this." And with the last word he closed the door in Eugene's face. Then, not moving away, he stood just inside the door, and noted that the misty silhouette remained upon the frosted glass for several moments, as if the forbidden gentleman debated in his mind what course to pursue. Let him ring again, George thought grimly, or try the side door, or the kitchen. But Eugene made no further attempt. The silhouette disappeared. Footsteps could be heard withdrawing across the floor of the veranda, and George, returning to the window in the reception room, was rewarded by the sight of an automobile manufacturer in baffled retreat, with all his wooing furs and fineries mocking him. Eugene got into his car slowly, not looking back at the house which had just taught him such a lesson, and it was easily visible, even from a window 70 feet distant, that he was not the same light suitor who had jumped so gallantly from the car only a few minutes earlier. Observing the heaviness of his movements as he climbed into the tonneau, George indulged in a sickish throat rumble which bore a distant cousinship to mirth. The car was quicker than its owner. It shot away as soon as he had sunk into his seat, and George, having watched its impetuous disappearance from his field of vision, ceased to haunt the window. He went to the library, and, seating himself beside the table whereon he had placed the photograph of his father, picked up a book and pretended to be engaged in reading it. Presently Isabel's buoyant step was heard descending the stairs, and her low, sweet whistling renewing the air of Lord Bateman. She came into the library, still whistling thoughtfully, a fur coat over her arm ready to put on, and 2 veils round her small black hat, her right hand engaged in buttoning the glove upon her left. And as the large room contained too many pieces of heavy furniture, and the inside shutters excluded most of the light of day, she did not at once perceive George's presence. Instead, she went to the bay window at the end of the room, which afforded a view of the street, and glanced out expectantly, then bent her attention upon her glove. After that, looked out toward the street again, ceased to whistle, and turned toward the interior of the room. "Why, Georgie!" She came, leaned over from behind him, and there was a faint, exquisite odor as from distant apple blossoms as she kissed his cheek. "Dear, I waited lunch almost an hour for you, but you didn't come. Did you lunch out somewhere?" "Yes." He did not look up from the book. "Did you have plenty to eat?" "Yes." "Are you sure? Wouldn't you like to have Maggie get you something now in the dining room? Or they could bring it to you here, if you think it would be cozier. Shan't I—" A tinkling bell was audible, and she moved to the doorway into the hall. "I'm going out driving, dear. She interrupted herself to address the housemaid, who was passing through the hall. "I think it's Mr. Morgan, Mary. Tell him I'll be there at once." "Yes, ma'am." Mary returned. "'Twas a peddler, ma'am." "Another one?" Isabel said, surprised. "I thought you said it was a peddler when the bell rang a little while ago." "Mr. George said it was, ma'am. He went to the door," Mary informed her, disappearing. "There seems to be a great many of them," Isabel mused. "What did yours want to sell, George?" "He didn't say." "You must have cut him off short," she laughed. And then, still standing in the doorway, she noticed the big silver frame upon the table beside him. "Gracious, Georgie!" she exclaimed. "You have been investing!" And as she came across the room for a closer view, Is it Lucy?" she asked half timidly, half archly. But the next instant she saw whose likeness was thus set forth in elegiac splendor, and she was silent, except for a long, just audible, "Oh." He neither looked up nor moved. "That was nice of you, Georgie," she said in a low voice presently. "I ought to have had it framed myself when I gave it to you." He said nothing, and standing beside him she put her hand gently upon his shoulder, then as gently withdrew it, and went out of the room. But she did not go upstairs. He heard the faint rustle of her dress in the hall, and then the sound of her footsteps in the reception room. After a time, silence succeeded even these slight tokens of her presence, whereupon George rose and went warily into the hall, taking care to make no noise, and he obtained an oblique view of her through the open double doors of the reception room. She was sitting in the chair which he had occupied so long, and she was looking out the window expectantly, a little troubled. He went back to the library, waited an interminable half hour, then returned noiselessly to the same position in the hall, where he could see her. She was still sitting patiently by the window. Waiting for that man, was she? Well, it might be quite a long wait, and the grim George silently ascended the stairs to his own room, and began to pace his suffering floor.